Good afternoon, everyone. Congratulations on making it through to the final presentation. I wanted to joke with Rolando. I wasn't sure if I got slotted last because it was alphabetical order or if it was just my good fortune. So all kidding aside, I would say I'm just really honored to be here to present at the first Belize Research Conference. It's been really an exciting couple of days. I've been really, frankly, kind of awed with all of the work that's going on. So congratulations to all the other presenters. Thanks in particular to the ISCR staff, Nigel, Rolando, and all the organizers for this opportunity. So I'm going to be talking today about a rather large interdisciplinary project. I think it's important to note that I am a cultural anthropologist, so that's sort of my role in this project. And I'm going to attempt to give you kind of a snapshot of this project, but there's going to be sort of an emphasis on the social science information. So we have funding from the U.S. National Science Foundation through Partnerships for International Research and Education grant. The primary goal was to investigate the impacts of expanding tourism and water energy development on local livelihoods, human well-being, and the surrounding environment on the peninsula in recent years. So I can't really imagine a better presentation to follow. I'm just sort of moving down the beach, essentially. So thank you. Just to give you a little bit of context before I kind of dive into the specifics of the presentation, we carried out research over a 3-year period, primarily during the months of May to July. There's a little bit of variability in the timing, so that's important to note and sort of thinking about the information that we're going to present. It's seasonal, which is one of its limitations. I'm going to talk about this a bit more in a minute, but we started off with a focus on water and an integrated water management system. And then we really shifted based on community feedback and suggestions and just the kinds of concerns that people were talking to us about, to looking at tourism development, environmental change on the peninsula over time, as well as how livelihoods were being impacted. And just to kind of give you an idea of the timing too, this was really the several years prior to cruise ship tourism beginning for this area. So it's important to note too, we've presented these results in 2016 to 2 communities on the peninsula that have sort of the largest number of population. This is also in an executive summary, which is available online, and I'd be happy to send copies of it to you. We did distribute it out a couple of years ago in 2016. We were handing out copies in the street to anyone who was interested in taking one, where there weren't very many folks, but I'm happy to share it. So one of the things I'm also going to mention that I think is something that I'd really like to continue to do more of going forward in my work here in Belize is that we also partnered with the University of Belize's Environmental Research Institute, and I see Dr. Kay is out there in the audience, so I just want to acknowledge the wonderful advice, although everything I say is, not in any way, all mistakes are my own. But she and her colleagues were extremely helpful and great partners with this work. So we had one graduate student in the Natural Resources program with UB who participated in social science research. We also had 3 undergraduate students who were doing aquatic water testing and soils testing with one of our environmental engineers. So this kind of sums up what our larger goal of this project was. As I mentioned, we're really interested in the intersection between tourism development, water and wastewater management, key resources, and how that relates to local livelihoods and how life is changing and environments are changing. So to frame this discussion, I'm going to talk really briefly about a topic of dispossession. And this has a kind of long-standing history in sort of writing by anthropologists as well as scholars from many other disciplines. But in thinking about this, I want you to, can anyone recognize I'm just going interactive here, which I know has not really been the style, but can anyone identify the picture here? Dr. Spang? I think that's right, yeah. So this, to me, it's an image that sort of captures this idea of not just dispossession, which is having something taken away from you, but having dispossession while you're still at home, which is something that's complex. And these are the kinds of questions that I think come to mind when you're asking this question about how tourism development might be impacting everyday lives on the peninsula. One is equitable, sustainable tourism development possible? Or is it an oxymoron? How does tourism development play out around the globe? I'm going to try to, in a minute, just kind of situate Belize in relation to what's happening in other similar places around the world. And then finally, how does access to resources such as water, energy, land change for local people as a result of this type of development? So I've looked to an anthropologist named Paige West, who's written recently, she published a book called Dispossession in the Environment, which is about tourism development in Papua New Guinea. So it's about as far from Belize as a person can get. However, when I'm reading her book, and I'm reading about the experiences of Gimi indigenous population that she works with, it could be Belize. Like if I just insert different, different terms, there are a lot of similarities. So it's a dynamic that many people around the globe are experiencing, particularly in coasts. The environmental imaginaries is one of the key drivers behind this. So I just want to kind of call your attention to one of the chapters of her book. It's called "We Are Here to Build Your Capacity: Development as a Vehicle for Accumulation and Dispossession." And in this case, accumulation means basically money, capital, and dispossession is taking things away. So I know that there are many, many different types of development, and this is a very specific critique, but I think it kind of captures, in one way, how development can play out for local communities. The other concept I want to introduce is the concept of an aperture, which it kind of builds off, a camera, how a camera functions. The idea that you can have a gap or a breach or an opening which serves as a catalyst for shifts in control over things like water, land, and other resources. So it allows sort of a sped up change in the landscape and a reorganization of power and control over that landscape. And I've written about this actually with regards to Hurricane Iris, which, as many of you recall, was in October 2001. I was actually here and experienced it myself. And I would argue, and I have in a published paper, have suggested that Iris kind of served as an aperture, an opening for a very much sped up process of development on the peninsula, and also in other parts of Belize as well. So this is just an aerial snapshot that kind of gives you a visual on some of these changes that happened. If you look, for example, shrimp farm development during this decade kind of gives you one idea. And then more recently, this municipal pier is now there. It's been built. One of the things that we're particularly interested in is when you have an event like Iris, what are the repercussions of that kind of shift in locus of power and control? So, as I mentioned, this was a very interdisciplinary project. So we have anthropologists and environmental engineers working on this project. I'm going to be mainly talking about the social science aspect here, but it's important to note that we're really trying to kind of link the data that we have about environmental monitoring on the peninsula with the social science information that I'm going to talk about here. So just really briefly, I mentioned the time frame of when we collected information. We did a lot of interviews. We spent a lot of time talking with not just key stakeholders or people in organizations, but also residents, neighbors. We also did very short surveys using cell phones, which was kind of technology that I was 100% against. My students suggested it, and I was like, no way that's going to work. It actually worked really, really well. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, I'd be happy to share. It's open source software that we used, because frankly, everyone's on their cell phone now, so it didn't present such an awkward barrier as I anticipated. So this is some of the analysis that we did of transcripts and focus groups and field notes. Again, this is the timeline of our project. Started in earnest in 2013 and kind of wrapped up in 2016. So I'm going to talk about 3 key themes with my remaining time. And I will have to say that there's so much information that we collected, it's very difficult to sort of select out what was most important to present in this venue today. So I decided to kind of emphasize the things that are also emphasized in our executive summary, so there could be kind of a document if you're interested in finding out more about it. But we, as I mentioned, we kind of shifted from a focus on a centralized wastewater system, which had been proposed as a result of an IDB grant. As far as I know, that system has not yet been constructed or finalized. Cruise ship tourism, and then land ownership and scale of tourism development. Okay, so these are the 3 key themes, just really quickly. One is the importance of scale. And as I mentioned in my abstract, first of all, it's very difficult to generalize Placencia residents, right? So let me just break that category down and just kind of hold that thought. I'll break that down in just a second. But we interview people up and down the peninsula, not just people in the village, not just people in Saint-Bay, but we really tried to kind of capture the whole peninsula. We interviewed tourists as well as locals, and that category of local is obviously very complicated and kind of fraught with contention. So we spent a lot of time arguing about that category. But I will say that over and over again, the idea that large-scale tourism that is essentially controlled and owned by people from other places was generally less desirable than tourism that's at home. One of the other themes that we looked at was environmental change. I had a master's student who did a photo voice project where she asked people to take pictures of how they had seen the landscape change over time. She also worked with someone who had some historical photos that were taken. So that was a way of kind of understanding how the landscape had changed. And then finally, the importance of identity and heritage and the people of the peninsula as perhaps its greatest resource. Okay, so I'm just going to present a couple of things about each of these themes really quickly. One, the impact of tourism development on livelihoods, and in particular thinking about the scale of tourism. So there's 2 quotes that you see here. We really tried to kind of match up our qualitative information with our quantitative survey data. So you're seeing a little bit of that going on here with how I've presented the information. So an NGO representative told us this in an interview. It has 2 sides. There are people who are genuine with their interests and wanting to see good come out of their projects, out of their business. And then again, you just have other people who just have money and believe that they can do what they want and have no regard for regulations. Another fisherman says, there's no place you can buy on the beach that's vacant for the locals. All the locals have to look for land on the lagoon side. So if all the prime land has been sold to foreign investors, I would say, it's just crazy right now with building. I guess you guys could see. And it is, it's quite obvious. One of the other things that we collected information about was not only how local residents feel about foreign investment, but how do tourists feel about this? Do they recognize the ironies of acting on the imaginaries that were just described, and coming to a place that is unspoiled and thereby spoiling it? For the most part, the answer was no. They didn't recognize that irony. And in fact, it was interesting. They were, I guess one out of four were pretty okay with foreign investment as something that they wanted to see. One of the other things that we talked with a lot of people about was scale of cruise ship tourism development. And at this point, this is probably a little bit less relevant because the decisions have already taken place. However, just as a kind of a historical snapshot, it's useful to know that large sort of mass cruise ship tourism was overall, particularly for residents, permanent residents of the peninsula, less desirable than pocket cruise ship tourism. Obviously, there's a lot of difference in opinion on this topic. It was a very sort of widely contested and debated topic throughout Belize, in a variety of forums, from Facebook to newspapers to, published articles. So I know it's a very contentious issue, but one of the things that we thought that it was helpful to kind of zero in on with this debate was the importance of scale. And scale is directly related to the idea of dispossession, I would argue. So scale is also linked to control over resources. Okay, now I'd like to kind of shift gears a bit and talk about change in the environment and access to resources. So one of the things that we asked our interviewees about was changes that they've observed in the landscape over their lifetime, in particular after 2001. Iris serves in the minds of Belizeans, in my own mind actually too, since I was here, as this sort of moment in time that everyone remembers, because it was sort of it's this sort of social, natural disaster. So thinking of that as kind of a marker for what happens next. So we talked with people a lot about that time frame. And one of the questions we asked was, which changes were a result of the tourism industry? So I think the percentages are probably less important than the information that people share with us about the kinds of changes they've seen to mangroves, to dredging, to the coral, to fish populations, to what happens with standing water on the peninsula. So these are all the kinds of things that people share with us. And I don't know if you guys can read what the drawing is here. It says people are throwing a lot of trash in the water, and the animals don't like it. The animals use trash for food. So this is actually from the sort of education outreach portion of our project, which I'm going to talk about at the end. But I think in general, the student's drawing really captures quite a lot of the dynamic that many people are concerned with on the peninsula, and that is things like beach erosion, dredging, filling, large construction projects, and really access to land and access to the beach. One of the other things that we were talking with people about was this proposed integrated water system. And again, the issue of sort of control over resources came up as very important in the sense that it was difficult to anticipate what the impact of that might be, particularly on residents who might have a harder time paying to connect up to that system, as you can see from this quote here. So although there's a recognition that there are elements of it that would be very beneficial, ecologically, cost and control over the design of the system was one of the big concerns. Okay, with my last minute I have toward the timekeeper, I'd like to talk about something which I feel as a cultural anthropologist is actually the most significant of all the things I wanted to share today, and that is the topic of identity and heritage and how that connects up with tourism and development. And I think this is, Placencia tour guide shared this with us. The essence, like I said, I think it's just the local spirit, the community spirit. Everybody is involved in everything. It's a small community. In the past, it was strictly a fishing community. The men would go out and fish, the ladies would stay home and take care of the kids and definitely provide for, but it was such like one big community. So, although at some level this is kind of a very idealistic description of what life on the peninsula might have been like at one time or in this individual's childhood, I think it also captures what the people who we spoke to were most concerned about losing through this process of dispossession was the feeling of being a small community, And even in the process of engaging in small-scale tourism, having more control over the shape and form of that tourism. The other thing I just want to highlight, and this is from our survey, we asked people what they saw as being a thing, the most significant thing or place associated with local culture and heritage. And I think it's really interesting that local people, the people themselves, really stood out as the most significant. So even though we're talking about a lot of changes to land, to access to land, I think people still see themselves as resilient and as able to navigate and negotiate things that are coming down the pipeline. There's a project that we've also been involved with. I won't have time to talk about it very much, but there's a museum that's being built on top of a former water tank in St. Bight. So this is an example of kind of linking up heritage and tourism on the community's own terms. Okay, so I'm not going to have too much time to talk about this last aspect of the project because I'm out of time. But I just wanted to kind of mention, I'm going to actually skip through these quite quickly. We partnered with a local primary school to do some curriculum activities that focused on water resources. And so these are some images from that study. And we asked kids to tell us where water comes from, where does it go. They drew really interesting pictures of water infrastructure, and they participated in an interpretive dance as a part of this curriculum. My graduate students were the ones who were lucky enough to design that. That wasn't me. But we did give a copy of this poster and some of the curriculum to the local schools. So just to kind of wrap up, these were some of the key themes that we identified. And really this idea about balancing conservation of coastal environment with development to maintain local livelihoods, coastal ecosystems, and heritage were all really significant themes that were shared with us in this work. So I'd like to thank all the very important people who contributed to this work. If you're interested in getting more information about it, that's my contact information. Thank you.